The Nile River flows through Egypt like a serpent of life, bringing water to a desert kingdom. But on one particular morning, over 3,000 years ago, this sacred river carried something unexpected. A small basket woven from papyrus reeds floated gently along the shore. Inside that basket lay a 3-month-old Hebrew baby boy. His mother had placed him there not out of cruelty, but out of desperate hope. Her name was Jochebed, and she had just made the hardest choice any mother could make. This baby was marked for death before he even took his first breath. Pharaoh, the god king of Egypt, had issued a terrifying decree. Every Hebrew male infant must be thrown into the Nile to drown. The Israelites had grown too numerous, too strong. Pharaoh feared they might rise up and overthrow Egyptian rule, so he decided to destroy them before they could become a threat. Hebrew boys were being ripped from their mother's arms and drowned in the very river that gave Egypt its life. But Jochebed refused to let her son die. For 3 months she hid him in her home. Every cry, every whimper could have exposed him. Every Egyptian patrol could have meant his death. But when she could hide him no longer, she crafted a plan born of faith and desperation. She wove a waterproof basket, placed her baby inside, and set him among the reeds where Pharaoh's daughter bathed. The princess of Egypt came to the river that morning with her attendants. The water sparkled under the Egyptian sun, and then she heard it, a baby's cry. Her servants found the basket and brought it to her. When she opened it, she saw a beautiful Hebrew baby crying. Scripture tells us in Exodus chapter 2 that she felt compassion for him. Here was an enemy child, one her father had condemned to death, but something in her heart would not let her walk away. Miriam, the baby's older sister, had been watching from a distance. She approached the princess with remarkable courage for a young Hebrew girl. She asked if the princess needed a Hebrew woman to nurse the child. The princess agreed. Miriam ran to get her own mother, and so Jochebed was paid to nurse her own son, the child she thought she had lost forever. God had turned a death sentence into a divine rescue. The princess named the baby Moses, which means drawn out of water. She adopted him as her own son. This Hebrew slave child would now grow up in the palace of the most powerful empire on earth. He would receive the education of Egyptian royalty. He would learn to read hieroglyphics, study mathematics and astronomy, train in military strategy. Moses would wear fine linen and eat from golden plates, but he would never forget who he truly was. The question haunts us even today. How did Moses learn about his heritage? Who told him he was Hebrew and not Egyptian? Was it his mother during those early nursing years? Was it his sister Miriam who watched over him? Or did he simply see the suffering of the Hebrew slaves and recognize something of himself in their faces? The Bible does not tell us exactly when Moses discovered the truth about his identity, but it tells us that when he grew up, he went out to his people and looked on their burdens. What Moses saw that day changed everything. Hebrew slaves hauling massive stones under the brutal Egyptian sun. Taskmasters with whips ensuring every man worked until his hands bled. Women and children laboring in brick pits, their bodies covered in mud and clay. These were his people, suffering under the empire that had raised him in luxury. And then Moses witnessed something that ignited a rage within him he could not control. An Egyptian taskmaster was beating a Hebrew slave mercilessly. Moses looked one way, then the other. He saw no one watching. And in that moment, the prince of Egypt made a choice that would define the rest of his life. He struck down the Egyptian and killed him. Then he hid the body in the sand. Moses had just murdered an Egyptian official. The adopted grandson of Pharaoh had killed one of his own people to save a Hebrew slave. There was no going back from this moment. The next day, Moses went out again. He saw 2 Hebrew men fighting each other. He tried to intervene and stop the violence, but one of the men turned on him with shocking words. "Who made you a ruler and judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Moses realized with cold dread that his secret was out. Someone had seen what he did. It was only a matter of time before Pharaoh learned the truth. And Pharaoh did learn the truth. His rage was absolute. The man he had raised as a son, the Hebrew he had protected and educated, had murdered an Egyptian. Pharaoh sent soldiers to execute Moses, but Moses fled into the wilderness, leaving behind the palaces, the power, the privilege. He ran for his life across the scorching desert, a fugitive with no home and no future. The prince had become a criminal. But God's plan for Moses was only beginning. Subscribe to journey with us through the incredible true story of Moses, a man who would return to Egypt not as a fugitive but as the deliverer of an entire nation. What happened to Moses in the wilderness? How did a shepherd become the greatest prophet in history? The answers will amaze you. Chapter 2. 2 words collide. Moses stumbled through the Sinai desert, a wanted man with nothing but the clothes on his back. The scorching sun beat down on him. His throat burned with thirst. Every sound made him turn, expecting Egyptian soldiers. He had gone from sleeping in silk sheets to collapsing in the dirt, from commanding servants to begging for water. This was the price of choosing his people over his privilege. After days of wandering, Moses arrived in the land of Midian, a region east of Egypt inhabited by nomadic tribes. He collapsed by a well, exhausted and hopeless. And that is where his life took another unexpected turn. 7 young women came to the well to draw water for their father's flocks. They were daughters of Jethro, a priest of Midian. But as they began to water their sheep, a group of rough shepherds tried to drive them away. Women were not respected in this culture. They were easy targets for bullies. Something rose up inside him, the same protective instinct that had led him to kill the Egyptian. He stood up and defended the women, driving away the shepherds. Then he helped the sisters water their flock. They returned home early that day, and their father Jethro was surprised. "Why are you home so quickly today?" They explained that an Egyptian had rescued them from the shepherds and even helped them water the flock. Jethro was astonished by their story. "Where is this man? Why did you leave him there? Invite him to eat with us." The sisters returned and brought Moses to their home. Jethro welcomed the stranger with generous hospitality. He saw something in Moses, perhaps nobility, perhaps weariness, perhaps mobility. Jethro offered Moses a place to stay, and Moses, who had nowhere else to go, accepted. Days turned into weeks, weeks turned into months. Moses began working as a shepherd for Jethro. Eventually, Jethro gave Moses his daughter Zipporah as his wife. This was an extraordinary gesture of trust and respect. Moses had gone from Egyptian royalty to Midianite shepherd. He had lost everything he once knew, but he had gained something else: a quiet life, a wife, and eventually a son named Gershom. The name means stranger there because Moses said he had been a stranger in a foreign land. Even in Midian, Moses felt displaced, caught between 2 worlds and belonging to neither. For 40 years, Moses lived in Midian. 40 years of tending sheep in the wilderness. 40 years of solitude and silence. 40 years of wondering if his life had any meaning at all. He had once been destined for greatness in Egypt. Now he was forgotten, a nobody shepherd in the middle of nowhere. Or so he thought. But God was preparing Moses in that wilderness. Every lonely day was shaping him. Every silent night was teaching him dependence. God was stripping away the pride of Egypt and replacing it with humility. One day, Moses was tending his father-in-law's flock near Mount Horeb, also called the Mountain of God. It was an ordinary day, the kind Moses had experienced thousands of times before. But then he saw something that stopped him cold. A bush was on fire. That was not unusual in the desert heat, but this bush was not burning up. The flames consumed nothing. The branches remained green. The fire did not spread. It just kept burning, alive and impossible. Moses turned aside to investigate this strange sight, and as he approached the bush, a voice called out to him, "Moses, Moses." He froze. "Do not come any closer. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground." Moses removed his sandals, his heart pounding. Then the voice continued, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." Moses hid his face, terrified to look at God. And then God spoke words that would change history. "I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey." Moses listened in stunned silence. God was speaking about the Hebrews, about slavery, about rescue. Then God said the words Moses never expected. "So now, go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt." Moses could not believe what he was hearing. Him, a fugitive shepherd, return to Egypt where he was wanted for murder, stand before Pharaoh and demand the release of the slaves. It was madness. Moses immediately objected. "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" God's answer was simple but profound. "I will be with you, and this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain." But Moses was not convinced. He asked more questions, raising one objection after another. "What if they do not believe me? What if they say, 'God did not appear to you?'" God responded by giving Moses miraculous signs to perform. His staff would turn into a serpent, his hand would become leprous, and then heal instantly. But Moses still resisted. He pleaded with God to send someone else. He claimed he was not eloquent, but he was slow of speech and tongue. Whether Moses had a speech impediment or simply lacked confidence, his fear was real. But God's patience was wearing thin. Who gave human beings their mouths? Who makes them deaf or mute? Who gives them sight or makes them blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go. I will help you speak and will teach you what to say. Moses continued to beg God to send anyone else. Finally, God's anger burned against Moses, but in his mercy, God provided a solution. "Your brother Aaron is already on his way to meet you. He can be your spokesman. You will speak to him and put words in his mouth. I will help both of you speak and will teach you what to do." Moses had run out of excuses. God had answered every objection. The call was clear. Moses had to return to Egypt. Moses said goodbye to his father-in-law Jethro and took his wife and sons with him. He held the staff of God in his hand, the same staff that would perform wonders beyond imagination. As Moses journeyed back toward Egypt, Aaron came to meet him at the mountain of God. The two brothers embraced. It had been decades since they had seen each other. Aaron listened as Moses explained everything God had said. Together they traveled to Egypt to gather the elders of Israel. Moses and Aaron assembled the Israelite leaders and told them everything the Lord had said. Aaron performed the miraculous signs before the people, and when the Israelites heard that the Lord had seen their misery and was concerned about them, they bowed down and worshipped. Hope had entered their hearts for the first time in generations. But hope is fragile. The battle for freedom was about to begin, and Pharaoh would not let his slaves go without a fight. Like this video if you are amazed by how God uses ordinary people for extraordinary purposes. Comment below what you think gave Moses the courage to return to Egypt after 40 years. Chapter 3. The Fugitive Prince. Before we continue with Moses' return to Egypt, we need to understand the world he left behind. Egypt was not just a nation, it was the superpower of the ancient world. Its civilization stretched back thousands of years before Moses was even born. The pyramids already stood as ancient monuments. The Sphinx gazed across the desert with stone eyes that had seen empires rise and fall. Egypt was wealthy, advanced, and absolutely convinced of its own superiority. At the heart of Egyptian power was Pharaoh. He was not just a king. Egyptians believed Pharaoh was a living god, the son of Ra, the sun deity. To defy Pharaoh was to defy the gods themselves. Pharaoh's word was absolute law. His power extended over millions of people. His armies were the most feared fighting force in the known world. And now Moses, a fugitive shepherd, was being sent by the god of slaves to challenge this god king. The Israelites had been in Egypt for over 400 years. Their ancestor Jacob, also called Israel, had brought his family to Egypt during a terrible famine. At that time, Jacob's son Joseph was second in command of all Egypt, having risen from slavery to power through God's providence. Joseph saved Egypt from starvation, and Pharaoh welcomed Joseph's family with honor. The Israelites settled in the region of Goshen, and for a time they prospered. But as the book of Exodus tells us, a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. This new Pharaoh saw only that the Israelites had multiplied greatly. They were numerous and powerful. Paranoia gripped the Egyptian leadership. What if these Hebrews joined with Egypt's enemies in war? What if they turned against their masters? Pharaoh's solution was brutal oppression. The Israelites were enslaved. They were forced to build entire cities for Pharaoh's glory. The Egyptians worked the Israelites ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with harsh labor in brick and mortar and with all kinds of work in the fields. Exodus chapter 1 records that the Egyptians used them ruthlessly, but the more the Hebrews were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. This terrified the Egyptians even more. So Pharaoh escalated his cruelty. He ordered the Hebrew midwives to kill every male baby born to Israelite women. The midwives, named Shiphrah and Puah, feared God more than they feared Pharaoh. They refused to murder the babies. When Pharaoh questioned them, they cleverly told him that Hebrew women were stronger than Egyptian women and gave birth before the midwives could arrive. God blessed these brave women for their courage. But Pharaoh responded with an even more savage command. Every Hebrew boy was to be thrown into the Nile River. It was into this nightmare that Moses was born. Moses' mother, Jochebed, was a woman of extraordinary faith. Hebrews chapter 11 tells us that by faith, Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born because they saw he was no ordinary child, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. They saw something special in their baby. Perhaps it was simply a mother's love. Perhaps it was divine revelation. Either way, Jochebed refused to let her son die. When she could no longer hide him, she took a papyrus basket, coated it with tar and pitch to make it waterproof, placed Moses inside, and put it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. The irony is stunning. Pharaoh had commanded that Hebrew boys be thrown into the Nile to drown. Jochebed obeyed the letter of the law, but defied its spirit. She did place her son in the Nile, but in a basket that would float and protect him. She put him exactly where Pharaoh's daughter bathed, the one place he might be found by someone with the power to save him. This was not random chance. This was faith acting with desperate wisdom. When Pharaoh's daughter discovered Moses and decided to adopt him, she unknowingly fulfilled God's plan. Moses would be raised in Pharaoh's household with every advantage Egypt could offer. He would learn to read and write in hieroglyphics, a skill reserved for the elite. He would study Egyptian law, military tactics, history, and religion. Acts chapter 7 tells us that Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was powerful in speech and action. He was being prepared for something far greater than an Egyptian throne. But Moses never forgot who he really was. Somewhere along the way, he learned the truth about his heritage. Perhaps his mother told him during those early years when she nursed him. Perhaps Miriam whispered the secret when she visited the palace. Perhaps Moses simply recognized the truth when he saw Hebrew slaves who looked like him. However it happened, Moses knew he was not Egyptian. He was Hebrew, and that knowledge created a war inside him. Imagine the internal conflict Moses experienced. By day, he walked the marble halls of Pharaoh's palace, dressed in royal linen. By night, he lay awake knowing his people were sleeping in mud brick hovels. He ate elaborate feasts while they survived on scraps. He enjoyed freedom while they knew only whips and chains. The guilt must have been crushing. The anger must have been overwhelming. Moses was living in the very seat of power that oppressed his people, and there was nothing he could do about it. Or was there? When Moses was 40 years old, according to Acts chapter 7, he decided to visit his own people, the Israelites. He saw them being forced to labor, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew slave, one of his own people. Moses looked around to make sure no one was watching. Then he killed the Egyptian and hid the body in the sand. It was a moment of passionate violence, an attempt to bring justice through his own strength. But it was also a disaster. The next day, Moses saw two Hebrews fighting. He tried to reconcile them, saying, "Men, you are brothers. Why do you want to hurt each other?" But one of them pushed Moses aside and said, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian yesterday?" Moses realized his crime was known. Fear gripped him. He had thought he was acting in secret, but someone had seen. And if one person knew, soon everyone would know, including Pharaoh. Sure enough, Pharaoh heard what Moses had done and tried to kill him. But Moses fled to Midian. He left behind palaces for deserts. He exchanged silk robes for shepherd's clothing. He went from commanding servants to serving sheep. Everything he had known was gone. Moses had tried to deliver his people through his own power, and it had ended in total failure. He was now a nobody, forgotten in the wilderness. But God was not finished with him. For 40 years, Moses lived as a shepherd. 40 years of silence, 40 years of obscurity, 40 years of wondering if his life had any meaning. But those years were not wasted. God was transforming Moses from an impulsive prince into a humble servant. The wilderness was stripping away his Egyptian pride and teaching him total dependence on God. When God finally spoke to Moses from the burning bush, Moses was no longer the confident young prince who thought he could save Israel through violence. He was a broken, humble shepherd who knew he could do nothing in his own strength. And that is exactly the kind of person God uses. Not the proud and self-sufficient, but the humble and dependent. Not those who trust in their own abilities, but those who trust in God's power. Moses had to lose everything before he could become the deliverer God intended. His 40 years in the palace taught him Egyptian culture and power. His 40 years in the wilderness taught him humility and faith. Both were necessary for what came next. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that God can use even our greatest failures for His purposes. What wilderness season are you in right now? Comment below. Chapter 4. Fire on the mountain. The burning bush was not just a miracle. It was an invitation. God was revealing Himself to Moses in a way that demanded a response. Fire in the ancient world represented God's presence, His holiness, His power. When Moses saw that bush burning but not consumed, he was seeing a picture of God Himself, eternal, powerful, holy, and utterly unlike anything in creation. This was not a God made of stone like the Egyptian idols. This was the living God who spoke and acted. When God called Moses by name from the bush, Moses responded, "Here I am." Those simple words mark a turning point in his life. He was acknowledging God's authority and expressing His availability. But when God told Moses to remove his sandals because he stood on holy ground, Moses began to understand the magnitude of this encounter. He was not just meeting a powerful being. He was meeting the creator of the universe, the God of his ancestors, the one who sees all and knows all. God identified Himself as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This was crucial. God was connecting Moses to a long history of covenant promises. Centuries earlier, God had promised Abraham that his descendants would become a great nation, that they would possess the land of Canaan, and that through them all nations would be blessed. Isaac and Jacob had received the same promises, but now Abraham's descendants were slaves in Egypt, and the promises seemed impossible. Yet God had not forgotten. He never forgets. God told Moses that He had seen the misery of His people, heard their crying, and was concerned about their suffering. This is one of the most beautiful revelations in all of Scripture. God sees, God hears, God cares. The Israelites might have thought God had abandoned them, but God was watching all along, waiting for the right moment to act, and now that moment had come. God declared his intention to rescue Israel from Egypt and bring them to a land flowing with milk and honey. Then came the commission. So now, go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. Moses was stunned. How could he possibly accomplish such a task? He was one man against the most powerful empire on earth. He was a fugitive wanted for murder. He had no army, no resources, no political power. The mission was absurd. So Moses asked the question that was burning in his mind. Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? God's answer was simple and profound. I will be with you. God did not give Moses a list of qualifications or reasons why he was the right person for the job. Instead, God pointed to his own presence as the guarantee of success. It did not matter who Moses was. What mattered was who God was. The mission would not succeed because of Moses' strength, wisdom, or ability. It would succeed because God was with him. That is the pattern we see throughout Scripture. God chooses the weak and the unqualified so that his power is clearly seen. But Moses was not satisfied. He asked another question. Suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? What shall I tell them? This was not just curiosity. Names in the ancient world represented character and identity. Moses was asking God to reveal himself more fully. Who are you really? The Israelites knew about the God of their ancestors, but they had lived in Egypt for centuries, surrounded by countless Egyptian gods. They needed to know this God was real and different. God answered Moses with one of the most mysterious and powerful statements in all of Scripture. I am WHO I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. The name in Hebrew is Yahweh, often written as Jehovah. It comes from the verb to be. God was declaring that he is the self-existent one, the eternal one, the one who simply is. He does not depend on anything or anyone. He has no beginning and no end. He is the source of all existence. This was a radical contrast to the gods of Egypt. Those gods were part of creation, tied to the sun, the river, animals, and natural forces. But Yahweh was above creation, outside time, the uncreated creator. He was not one God among many. He was the only true God. When Moses went back to Egypt and told the Israelites that I am had sent him, he was declaring that the God of their ancestors was the supreme ruler of the universe. God also gave Moses specific instructions. He was to gather the elders of Israel and tell them that the Lord, the God of their fathers, had appeared to him. He was to explain that God had seen their misery and would bring them out of Egypt into a good and spacious land. Then Moses and the elders were to go to Pharaoh and request permission to take a 3-day journey into the wilderness to offer sacrifices to God. This was a test. Would Pharaoh recognize God's authority? God warned Moses that Pharaoh would refuse. But I know that the king of Egypt will not let you go unless a mighty hand compels him. So I will stretch out my hand and strike the Egyptians with all the wonders that I will perform among them. After that, he will let you go. God was revealing his plan. There would be confrontation, miracles, judgment, and ultimately deliverance. Pharaoh's stubbornness would become the stage on which God displayed his power to both Egypt and Israel. But Moses still hesitated. He raised another objection. What if they do not believe me or listen to me and say, "The Lord did not appear to you"? Moses was afraid the Israelites would reject him. After all, 40 years had passed since he had lived in Egypt. The Israelites might not remember him. They might think he was a fraud or delusional. So God gave Moses 3 miraculous signs to prove his divine commission. First, God asked Moses what he was holding. "A staff," Moses replied. God told him to throw it on the ground. When Moses did, the staff turned into a snake. Moses ran from it in fear, but God told him to reach out and grab it by the tail. When Moses obeyed, the snake became a staff again. This sign demonstrated God's power over creation. The staff represented Moses' occupation as a shepherd. When it became a snake, It symbolized danger and threat. When it returned to a staff, it showed God's control over all things. The second sign was even more dramatic. God told Moses to put his hand inside his cloak. When Moses pulled it out, his hand was leprous, diseased, white as snow. Leprosy was a dreaded disease, a symbol of uncleanness and death. But when Moses put his hand back in his cloak and pulled it out again, it was completely healed, restored as healthy as the rest of his body. This sign demonstrated God's power over disease and death. It showed that God could bring life from death, health from sickness. The third sign involved water from the Nile. God told Moses that if the Israelites still did not believe after the first two signs, he should take some water from the Nile and pour it on the dry ground. The water would turn into blood. This sign was particularly significant because the Nile was sacred to the Egyptians. It was worshipped as a god. By turning Nile water into blood, God was declaring his superiority over the gods of Egypt. He was showing that he controlled even what Egypt worshipped. But even with all these assurances, Moses still resisted. He brought up another objection. "Pardon your servant, Lord. I have never been eloquent, neither in the past nor since you have spoken to your servant. I am slow of speech and tongue." Whether he had a speech impediment, lacked confidence, or simply felt inadequate, his fear was real. How could he stand before Pharaoh and deliver God's message if he could not speak well? God's response revealed both patience and frustration. Who gave human beings their mouths? Who makes them deaf or mute? Who gives them sight or makes them blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go. I will help you speak and will teach you what to say. God was reminding Moses that he was the creator. If Moses had a speech problem, God had allowed it for a purpose, and God was fully capable of enabling Moses to speak when necessary. The issue was not Moses' ability, but his willingness to trust God. Still, Moses begged God to send someone else. "Please, Lord, send someone else. Please, Lord, send someone else." At this point, the Lord's anger burned against Moses. God's patience had limits, but even in his anger, God showed mercy. He told Moses that his brother Aaron was already on his way to meet him. Aaron was a good speaker. He would serve as Moses' spokesman. Moses would tell Aaron what to say, and Aaron would speak to the people and to Pharaoh. God would help both of them. Moses finally accepted the mission. He returned to his father-in-law, Jethro, and asked permission to go back to Egypt to see if any of his people were still alive. Jethro blessed him and told him to go in peace. Meanwhile, the Lord spoke to Moses again and assured him that all those who wanted to kill him in Egypt were now dead. Moses took his wife Zipporah and his sons and set out for Egypt, carrying the staff of God in his hand. As Moses traveled, God gave him one more critical instruction. "When you return to Egypt, see that you perform before Pharaoh all the wonders I have given you the power to do, but I will harden his heart so that he will not let the people go." This raises a difficult question that scholars and believers have debated for centuries. Why would God harden Pharaoh's heart? Was Pharaoh not responsible for his own choices? The answer is complex, but the text makes clear that Pharaoh hardened his own heart first, and then God confirmed him in his rebellion. Pharaoh's stubbornness would serve God's purpose by allowing more displays of divine power. Subscribe now to see what happens when Moses finally confronts Pharaoh. The battle between the God of Israel and the gods of Egypt is about to begin, and the outcome will shake the ancient world. Chapter 5. Confronting the Twern. Moses and Aaron stood at the gates of Pharaoh's palace, two elderly shepherds about to challenge the mightiest ruler on earth. The palace was a monument to Egyptian glory, with towering pillars covered in hieroglyphics, walls painted with scenes of Pharaoh conquering his enemies, and statues of gods with animal heads and human bodies. Everything about this place was designed to intimidate, to remind visitors that Pharaoh was not just a man but a god. The guards led Moses and Aaron into the throne room. Pharaoh sat elevated above everyone else, wearing the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. His eyes were lined with dark coal. His chest was adorned with gold and precious stones. Attendants stood on either side, and priests of the Egyptian gods watched with suspicion. Moses had not been in this palace for 40 years, but the memories came flooding back. He had once walked these halls as a prince. Now he walks them as a prophet. Moses and Aaron bowed, not in worship of Pharaoh, but in recognition of his earthly authority. Then they delivered their message. "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Let my people go, so that they may hold a festival to me in the wilderness." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Moses was not asking, he was declaring God's command. This was a direct confrontation between the God of the Hebrew slaves and the God King of Egypt. Pharaoh's response was swift and arrogant. "Who is the Lord that I should obey him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go." To Pharaoh, the idea was absurd. Let his valuable slaves go. Lose the workforce that built his cities, made his bricks, harvested his crops. And who was this Lord the Hebrews claimed to serve? Pharaoh worshipped Ra, Horus, Osiris, Isis, and dozens of other deities. The gods of Egypt were ancient and powerful. What was one more god, especially the god of slaves? Moses and Aaron tried again. They explained that the God of the Hebrews had met with them and commanded them to take a 3-day journey into the wilderness to offer sacrifices. If they did not obey, God might strike them with plagues or the sword. But Pharaoh was not moved. In fact, he was angry. He accused Moses and Aaron of trying to distract the people from their work. "Why are you taking the people away from their labor? Get back to your work." Pharaoh saw this religious request as a threat to his economic and political control. Then Pharaoh did something cruel and calculated. He gave orders to the slave drivers and overseers. "You are no longer to supply the people with straw for making bricks. Let them go and gather their own straw, but require them to make the same number of bricks as before. Do not reduce the quota. They are lazy. That is why they are crying out, 'Let us go and sacrifice to our God.' Make the work harder for the people so that they keep working and pay no attention to lies." This was psychological warfare. Pharaoh wanted to break the Israelites' spirit. By increasing their workload, he would make them too exhausted to think about freedom, and by blaming Moses and Aaron for the harsher conditions, he would turn the people against their would-be deliverers. It was a brilliant strategy. The slave drivers went out and announced the new policy. The Israelites were shocked and terrified. They had to make the same number of bricks but now also gather their own straw, a time-consuming task. The Israelite overseers, men chosen from among the Hebrews to supervise the work, tried to meet the impossible quotas, but they could not. When they failed, the Egyptian slave drivers beat them. The overseers went to Pharaoh to plead for mercy. "Why have you treated your servants this way? Your servants are given no straw, yet we are told to make bricks. Your servants are being beaten, but the fault is with your own people." Pharaoh showed no compassion. "Lazy, that is what you are, lazy. That is why you keep saying, 'Let us go and sacrifice to the Lord.' Now get to work. You will not be given any straw, yet you must produce your full quota of bricks." The overseers left Pharaoh's presence in despair, and when they encountered Moses and Aaron waiting outside, their anger exploded. "May the Lord look on you and judge you. You have made us obnoxious to Pharaoh and his officials, and have put a sword in their hand to kill us." Moses was devastated. He had come to Egypt to deliver his people, and instead their suffering had increased. The Israelites hated him. Pharaoh mocked him. The mission seemed to be a complete disaster. Moses went back to God and poured out his frustration in prayer. "Why, Lord? Why have you brought trouble on this people? Is this why you sent me? Ever since I went to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has brought trouble on this people, and you have not rescued your people at all." It was a raw, honest prayer, the kind of prayer that shows Moses' humanity. He did not understand what God was doing. Everything seemed to be going wrong. But God was not caught off guard. He knew exactly what was happening. Pharaoh's cruelty was only increasing the need for divine intervention. The Israelites had to reach a point where they had no hope in human solutions. Only then would God's deliverance be seen as the miracle it truly was. God responded to Moses with reassurance and a renewed promise. "Now you will see what I will do to Pharaoh. Because of my mighty hand, he will let them go. Because of my mighty hand, he will drive them out of his country." God also reminded Moses of the covenant promises made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. "I am the Lord. I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob as God Almighty, but by my name, the Lord, I did not make myself fully known to them. I also established my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan." God continued, "I have heard the groaning of the Israelites, whom the Egyptians are enslaving, and I have remembered my covenant. Therefore, say to the Israelites, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. I will free you from being slaves to them, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with mighty acts of judgment. I will take you as my own people, and I will be your God. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God, who brought you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians." These words contain some of the most powerful promises in Scripture. God was declaring 4 things. First, I will bring you out. Second, I will free you. Third, I will redeem you. Fourth, I will take you as my own people. This was not just physical deliverance. It was the establishment of a covenant relationship. God was claiming Israel as his treasured possession, and he was about to demonstrate his power in a way the world had never seen. Moses repeated God's message to the Israelites, but they did not listen to him because of their discouragement and harsh labor. Their spirits were crushed. They could not believe that deliverance was possible. This is the tragedy of oppression. It does not just break the body, it breaks the soul. The Israelites had been enslaved for so long that they could not imagine freedom. Hope seemed like a cruel joke. God then told Moses to go back to Pharaoh and demand that he let the Israelites go. Moses objected. "If the Israelites will not listen to me, why would Pharaoh listen to me, since I speak with faltering lips?" But God was not asking for Moses' opinion. He was giving him a command, and to strengthen Moses, God appointed both Moses and Aaron to speak to Pharaoh. Aaron would do the talking, but Moses would be the one giving the message. Moses and Aaron returned to Pharaoh. This time, they came prepared to demonstrate God's power. Pharaoh, surrounded by his magicians and advisors, demanded proof. "Perform a miracle." Aaron threw his staff on the ground, and it became a snake. The Egyptian magicians did the same thing through their secret arts. Their staffs also became snakes. But then something astonishing happened. Aaron's staff swallowed up the staffs of the magicians. This was a clear demonstration of God's superiority. The magicians could imitate the miracle to some degree, but they could not overcome it. Aaron's snake consumed theirs. It was a symbolic victory, a preview of what was coming. The God of Israel was about to consume the gods of Egypt, but Pharaoh's heart was hard. He refused to listen, just as the Lord had predicted. The battle lines were drawn. Pharaoh would not yield. God would not relent, and Egypt was about to experience the wrath of the Almighty. Comment below what you would have done if you were Moses facing Pharaoh's refusal. Would you have trusted God or given up? Chapter 6. 10 strikes against Hashavan. God's war with Egypt was not just about freeing slaves. It was about demonstrating to the entire world that he alone was God. The plagues that followed were surgical strikes against the gods of Egypt, each one designed to humiliate a specific deity and prove that Yahweh was supreme. Egypt worshipped creation. God was about to show that he controlled creation. Egypt trusted in its gods. God was about to show that those gods were powerless. The first plague struck at the heart of Egyptian religion, the Nile River. Egyptians worshipped the Nile as the god Hapi, the source of life and prosperity. Every year, the Nile flooded and brought fertile soil to the fields. Without the Nile, Egypt would be a desert, so when God told Moses to stretch out his staff over the waters of Egypt, he was attacking Egypt's most sacred symbol. Aaron lifted the staff and struck the water of the Nile. Immediately, the river turned to blood. The fish died. The water smelled rotten. Egyptians could not drink from the river. They had to dig along the banks to find fresh water. The blood lasted 7 days, a full week of horror. But Pharaoh's magicians duplicated the miracle through their secret arts, turning water into blood as well. Because they could imitate it, Pharaoh hardened his heart and refused to let the people go. The first plague had failed to break him, but God was just beginning. 7 days later, God sent Moses back to Pharaoh with another warning. "Let my people go. If you refuse, I will send a plague of frogs on your whole country." Pharaoh ignored the warning. So Aaron stretched out his hand over the waters of Egypt, and frogs came up and covered the land. Not just a few frogs, millions of them. They came into Pharaoh's palace, into his bedroom, into his bed. They invaded the houses of his officials and his people. They filled the ovens and kneading troughs. Frogs were everywhere, on everyone, inescapable and disgusting. This plague targeted the Egyptian goddess Heket, who was depicted as a frog and associated with fertility and childbirth. By sending a plague of frogs, God was mocking this deity, but again Pharaoh's magicians were able to produce frogs through their sorcery. However, they could not remove the frogs. Only God could do that. Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and begged them to pray to the Lord to take the frogs away. "I will let your people go to offer sacrifices to the Lord." Moses agreed and prayed. God removed the frogs. They died in the houses, courtyards, and fields. The Egyptians piled them into heaps, and the land reeked of death. But as soon as Pharaoh saw relief, he hardened his heart again and refused to let the Israelites go. He had lied. This pattern would repeat throughout the plagues. Pharaoh would beg for relief, promise to let the people go, and then go back on his word as soon as the suffering stopped. The third plague came without warning. God told Moses to have Aaron stretch out his staff and strike the dust of the ground. When he did, the dust turned into gnats throughout Egypt. Gnats swarmed on people and animals alike. This time, the magicians tried to produce gnats through their secret arts, but they could not. They said to Pharaoh, "This is the finger of God." Even the pagan sorcerers recognized divine power, but Pharaoh's heart remained hard. The fourth plague was flies. Swarms of them filled the houses of Egyptians and covered the ground. But this time, God made a distinction. The land of Goshen, where the Israelites lived, had no flies. This was a clear sign that God was protecting his people while judging Egypt. Pharaoh called for Moses and Aaron and said, "Go, sacrifice to your God here in the land." But Moses refused. That would not fulfill God's command. They had to go 3 days' journey into the wilderness. Pharaoh reluctantly agreed, but warned Moses not to go very far. Moses prayed, and God removed the flies. But once again, Pharaoh hardened his heart and would not let the people go. His stubbornness was becoming a pattern of self-destruction. The fifth plague struck the livestock of Egypt. God sent a terrible disease that killed the horses, donkeys, camels, cattle, sheep, and goats, but not a single animal belonging to the Israelites died. Pharaoh sent investigators to confirm this, and they reported that it was true. Still, his heart was hard. The sixth plague was painful and personal. God told Moses and Aaron to take handfuls of soot from a furnace and toss it into the air in Pharaoh's presence. When they did, the soot became fine dust that settled over all Egypt. It caused festering boils to break out on people and animals. Even the magicians could not stand before Moses because of the boils. Their power was broken. They could no longer oppose God's servants. But Pharaoh's heart remained hard, just as the Lord had predicted. The seventh plague was devastating. God sent a hailstorm unlike anything Egypt had ever seen. Fire flashed in the hail, and it struck down everything in the fields, both people and animals. It beat down every plant and stripped every tree. Only in Goshen, where the Israelites lived, was there no hail. Some of Pharaoh's officials feared the word of the Lord and brought their slaves and livestock inside. But those who ignored the warning lost everything. Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and confessed, "This time I have sinned. The Lord is in the right, and I and my people are in the wrong. Pray to the Lord, for we have had enough thunder and hail. I will let you go. You do not need to stay any longer." Moses agreed to pray, but he told Pharaoh, "I know that you and your officials still do not fear the Lord God." Moses went out of the city and spread out his hands toward the Lord God. The thunder and hail stopped, but when Pharaoh saw this, he sinned again and hardened his heart. The 8th plague was locusts. God sent an east wind that brought locusts in such numbers that they covered the ground until it was black. They devoured everything the hail had left. Not a green thing remained on any tree or plant in all the land of Egypt. Pharaoh's officials begged him to let the Israelites go. "How long will this man be a snare to us? Let the people go so they may worship the Lord their God. Do you not yet realize that Egypt is ruined?" Pharaoh called Moses and Aaron back and tried to negotiate. "Go, worship the Lord your God. But who will be going?" Moses replied, "We will go with our young and our old, with our sons and our daughters, and with our flocks and herds, because we are to celebrate a festival to the Lord." Pharaoh refused. He would only allow the men to go. Moses and Aaron were driven out of Pharaoh's presence. God sent the locusts, and after they came, Pharaoh again begged for forgiveness. Moses prayed, and God sent a strong west wind that carried the locusts into the Red Sea. But Pharaoh hardened his heart once more. The 9th plague was darkness. God told Moses to stretch out his hand toward the sky, and total darkness covered Egypt for 3 days. It was a thick darkness that could be felt. No one could see anyone else or move about for 3 days. Yet all the Israelites had light in the places where they lived. This plague struck at Ra, the sun god, the supreme deity of Egypt. If Ra could not bring light, then Ra was powerless. Pharaoh's claim to be the son of Ra was exposed as a lie. Pharaoh summoned Moses again and said, "Go, worship the Lord. Even your women and children may go with you. Only leave your flocks and herds behind." But Moses insisted, "Our livestock too must go with us. Not a hoof is to be left behind." Pharaoh's anger burned. He shouted at Moses, "Get out of my sight. Make sure you do not appear before me again. The day you see my face, you will die." Moses replied, "Just as you say. I will never appear before you again." But there was one more plague coming, the most terrible of all, and it would finally break Pharaoh's stubborn heart. Like this video if you are amazed at God's power over creation. What stands out most to you about these plagues? Share your thoughts in the comments. Chapter 7. The Night of Blood and Freedom. God told Moses that he would bring one more plague on Pharaoh and on Egypt. After that, Pharaoh would let the Israelites go. In fact, he would drive them out completely. This final plague would be so devastating that Egypt would beg the Hebrews to leave. God instructed Moses to tell the people to ask their Egyptian neighbors for articles of silver and gold. The Lord made the Egyptians favorably disposed toward the people, and they gave them what they asked for. Israel was about to plunder Egypt. Moses delivered God's final warning to Pharaoh. This is what the Lord says, "About midnight I will go throughout Egypt. Every firstborn son in Egypt will die, from the firstborn son of Pharaoh, who sits on the throne, to the firstborn son of the female slave, who is at her handmill, and all the firstborn of the cattle as well. There will be loud wailing throughout Egypt, worse than there has ever been or ever will be again. But among the Israelites not a dog will bark at any person or animal. Then you will know that the Lord makes a distinction between Egypt and Israel." This plague was different from all the others. It was not a natural disaster that could be explained away. It was a supernatural act of judgment. The firstborn in every Egyptian household would die in a single night. This was God's response to Pharaoh's original decree to kill all Hebrew baby boys. Egypt had murdered innocent children. Now Egypt would experience the same horror. This was justice, terrible and absolute. But God also provided a way of escape for his people. He gave Moses and Aaron detailed instructions for what would become the Passover, one of the most important events in Jewish history. On the 10th day of the month, each Israelite family was to select a lamb, a year-old male without defect. They were to care for it until the 14th day and then slaughter it at twilight. They were to take some of the blood and put it on the sides and tops of the doorframes of their houses. That night, they were to roast the lamb and eat it with bitter herbs and bread made without yeast. God explained the significance. The blood will be a sign for you on the houses where you are, and when I see the blood, I will pass over you. No destructive plague will touch you when I strike Egypt. This is a day you are to commemorate. For the generations to come, you shall celebrate it as a festival to the Lord, a lasting ordinance. The lamb's blood would protect the Israelites. It would mark them as God's people, covered by a substitute sacrifice. This is one of the most profound pictures of redemption in all of Scripture. The innocent lamb died so that the firstborn could live. Centuries later, John the Baptist would point to Jesus and say, "Look, the Lamb of God, who takes away the sin of the world." The Passover lamb foreshadowed Jesus, the ultimate sacrifice whose blood would cover all who believe in him. The Israelites were saved not by their own goodness, but by the blood of the lamb. The Israelites followed God's instructions. They selected their lambs, slaughtered them at twilight, and spread the blood on their door frames. They roasted the meat and ate it in haste, dressed and ready to leave at a moment's notice. Their sandals were on their feet, their staffs in their hands. They ate quickly because they were about to depart. After 400 years of slavery, their freedom was finally at hand, but it would come at a terrible cost to Egypt. At midnight, the Lord struck down all the firstborn in Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sat on the throne, to the firstborn of the prisoner in the dungeon, and the firstborn of all the livestock as well. Pharaoh and all his officials and all the Egyptians got up during the night, and there was loud wailing in Egypt, for there was not a house without someone dead. Imagine the horror. In every Egyptian home, a child or young person lay dead. The crown prince of Egypt, Pharaoh's own son and heir, was dead. The servants' children were dead. The livestock were dead. Egypt was devastated. Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron during the night. "Up, leave my people, you and the Israelites. Go, worship the Lord as you have requested. Take your flocks and herds as you have said, and go, and also bless me." The great Pharaoh, who had claimed to be a god, was now begging the Hebrew prophet for a blessing. His pride was shattered. His power was broken. His son was dead. The Egyptians urged the people to hurry and leave the country, for otherwise, they said, "we will all die." The Israelites did as Moses instructed. They asked the Egyptians for articles of silver and gold and for clothing. The Lord had made the Egyptians favorably disposed toward the people, and they gave them what they asked for. So they plundered the Egyptians. This was not theft. It was payment for 400 years of unpaid labor. The Israelites had built Egypt's cities, harvested its crops, made its bricks. Now they were taking what they were owed. The Israelites journeyed from Ramesses to Succoth. There were about 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children. Many other people went up with them, and also large droves of livestock, both flocks and herds. This was not just a family leaving quietly. This was a mass exodus, possibly 2 million people or more, when you count women, children, and the mixed multitude of non-Israelites who joined them. It was the largest slave revolt in history, but it was not accomplished by violence. It was accomplished by God. The Israelites had lived in Egypt for 430 years, just as God had predicted to Abraham centuries earlier. In Genesis chapter 15, God told Abraham that his descendants would be enslaved and mistreated for 400 years, but afterward they would come out with great possessions. That prophecy was now fulfilled. God had not forgotten his promise. He had been faithful across generations. As the Israelites marched out of Egypt, they carried the bones of Joseph with them. Joseph had made the Israelites swear an oath before he died. God will surely come to your aid, and then you must carry my bones up from this place. Joseph believed God's promise that Israel would one day leave Egypt and return to Canaan. Now, hundreds of years later, his faith was being honored. His bones were going home. The Israelites camped at Sukkoth, then moved on to Etham on the edge of the desert. By day, the Lord went ahead of them in a pillar of cloud to guide them on their way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, so that they could travel by day or night. The pillar of cloud and fire never left its place in front of the people. This visible manifestation of God's presence was a constant reminder that they were not wandering aimlessly. God was leading them. But back in Egypt, Pharaoh was having second thoughts. What have we done? We have let the Israelites go and have lost their services. Pharaoh's heart, which had been broken by grief, was hardening again with pride and greed. He could not accept that the slaves had escaped. He could not tolerate the loss of control. So he ordered his army to pursue the Israelites and bring them back. He took 600 of the best chariots, along with all the other chariots of Egypt, with officers over all of them. The Egyptian army was the most advanced military force in the world. Their chariots were fast and deadly. Their soldiers were trained and experienced. And now they were racing across the desert to recapture the fleeing slaves. The Israelites, meanwhile, were camped by the Red Sea, exactly where God had told them to camp. They had no idea that Pharaoh's army was coming, but God knew, and he was about to display his power in the most dramatic way yet. Subscribe now to see the most famous miracle in the Old Testament. The parting of the Red Sea is coming next, and it will leave you speechless. Chapter 8, Quails of Water. The Israelites looked back and saw the dust rising in the distance. Then they saw the glint of bronze and gold in the sunlight, chariots, hundreds of them, racing toward the Israelite camp. Pharaoh's entire army was bearing down on them with murderous intent. The Israelites were terrified. They were trapped between the Red Sea and the approaching army. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. They turned on Moses in fear and anger. Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, leave us alone? Let us serve the Egyptians. It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert. Their words revealed their lack of faith. Just days earlier, they had celebrated their freedom. Now they wished they were back in slavery. Fear had erased their memory of God's miraculous deliverance. Moses stood before the panicking crowd and spoke words of faith that echo through the ages. Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. Moses did not know exactly how God would save them, but he knew God would. His confidence was not in a plan, but in a person. God had brought them out of Egypt. God would not abandon them now. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to move on. Raise your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea to divide the water so that the Israelites can go through the sea on dry ground." God was about to do the impossible. He was about to split the sea. But before he did, he made one more strategic move. The angel of God, who had been traveling in front of Israel's army, withdrew and went behind them. The pillar of cloud also moved from in front and stood behind them, coming between the armies of Egypt and Israel. Throughout the night, the cloud brought darkness to one side and light to the other side. The Egyptians were plunged into confusion and darkness. The Israelites had light and could see clearly. The cloud acted as a barrier, preventing the Egyptian army from attacking during the night, but it was only a temporary protection. When morning came, the Egyptians would charge, unless God intervened. Moses stretched out his hand over the sea. And all that night the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. The waters were divided. Think about this for a moment. The Red Sea did not just split instantly. All night long, a supernatural wind blew with such force that it pushed back millions of gallons of water. The sea floor was exposed. The mud dried into solid ground. This was not a shallow marsh the Israelites walked through. This was the sea itself, divided by the hand of God. When morning came, the Israelites saw a path through the sea. Walls of water stood on their right and on their left, held in place by God's power. It was the most astonishing sight any of them had ever seen. Moses gave the command, and the Israelites moved forward into the sea. Parents carried children, the elderly leaned on the young. Flocks of sheep and herds of cattle were driven through. 2 million people walked on dry ground through the middle of the sea. Can you imagine the faith it took to step into that path? The walls of water towered above them. One mistake, one moment of God's power lifting, and they would all be drowned. But they walked forward in obedience and trust, step by step, family by family, tribe by tribe. The Israelites crossed through the Red Sea. It must have taken hours, but God held the waters back until every last person and animal had passed through safely. The Egyptians, seeing the Israelites escaping, charged after them. Pharaoh's chariots and horsemen followed them into the sea. But during the last watch of the night, the Lord looked down from the pillar of fire and cloud at the Egyptian army and threw it into confusion. He jammed the wheels of their chariots so that they had difficulty driving. The Egyptians said, "Let's get away from the Israelites. The Lord is fighting for them against Egypt." God told Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea so that the waters may flow back over the Egyptians and their chariots and horsemen." Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at daybreak the sea went back to its place. The Egyptians were fleeing toward it, and the Lord swept them into the sea. The water crashed down on the Egyptian army with unstoppable force. Chariots were overturned, horses were swept away. Soldiers in heavy bronze armor sank like stones. The army that had terrorized Israel for generations was destroyed in minutes. Not one of them survived. The Lord swept them into the sea. The water flowed back and covered the chariots and horsemen. The entire army of Pharaoh that had followed the Israelites into the sea, not one of them survived. The Israelites stood on the opposite shore and watched in awe. The bodies of Egyptian soldiers washed up on the beach. The chariots were shattered and scattered. The mightiest army on earth had been annihilated without the Israelites lifting a sword. God had fought for them, just as Moses said he would. And that day the Lord saved Israel from the hands of the Egyptians. And Israel saw the Egyptians lying dead on the shore. And when the Israelites saw the mighty hand of the Lord displayed against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord and put their trust in him and in Moses his servant. In response to this incredible miracle, Moses and the Israelites sang a song of praise to God. It is recorded in Exodus chapter 15, one of the oldest songs in the Bible. "I will sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. Both horse and driver he has thrown into the sea. The Lord is my strength and my defense. He has become my salvation. He is my God, and I will praise him, my father's God, and I will exalt him. The Lord is a warrior. The Lord is his name." The song celebrates God's power, his faithfulness, and his love for Israel. It declares that no other God is like the Lord. "Who among the gods is like you, Lord? Who is like you, majestic in holiness, awesome in glory, working wonders?" The Israelites finally understood what Moses had been trying to tell them all along. The God of their ancestors was real, powerful, and faithful. He had heard their cries, remembered his covenant, and delivered them with a mighty hand. But the Red Sea crossing was more than just a historical event. It became a defining moment in Israel's identity. For the rest of their history, the Israelites would look back to this moment as proof that God was with them. Prophets would refer to it. Psalmists would sing about it. Parents would tell their children about the night God split the sea. The crossing became a symbol of God's power to save, to deliver, to make a way where there is no way. And for us today, the Red Sea crossing still speaks. It reminds us that God can make a way when we see no way. It shows us that what seems impossible to us is effortless for God. It challenges us to trust God even when we are surrounded by enemies and obstacles. It encourages us to move forward in obedience, even when the path looks terrifying. And it assures us that God fights for His people. We need only to be still. Comment below what impossible situation you are facing right now. Remember, the same God who parted the Red Sea is with you today. Chapter 9. Manna and Rebellion. The Israelites were free. Egypt was behind them. The Red Sea was a testimony to God's power, but ahead of them lay a wilderness, vast and unforgiving. And freedom, they would soon discover, came with new challenges. The journey from the Red Sea to Mount Sinai took the Israelites through some of the harshest terrain on earth. The desert was hot during the day, cold at night, and almost completely barren. There were no fields to harvest, no rivers to drink from, no cities to trade with. It was just sand, rocks, and occasional oases. After 3 days of traveling in the desert of Shur, the Israelites found no water. When they came to Marah, they discovered a spring, but the water was bitter and undrinkable. The people grumbled against Moses. "What are we to drink?" Moses cried out to the Lord, and God showed him a piece of wood. When Moses threw it into the water became sweet. This was the first test of Israel's faith in the wilderness, and it revealed a pattern that would repeat throughout their journey. Crisis, complaint, prayer, miracle. God used this moment to teach the Israelites a lesson. If you listen carefully to the Lord your God and do what is right in His eyes, if you pay attention to His commands and keep all His decrees, I will not bring on you any of the diseases I brought on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you. God was establishing His expectations. Obedience would bring blessing. Disobedience would bring consequences. It was a simple covenant, but the Israelites would struggle to keep it. From Marah, they traveled to Elim, where there were 12 springs and 70 palm trees. It was a place of rest and refreshment, but it did not last long. The whole Israelite community set out from Elim and came to the desert of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai. They had been traveling for a month and a half since leaving Egypt, and now their food supplies were running out. Once again, the Israelites grumbled against Moses and Aaron. "If only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted, but you have brought us out into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death." Their complaint was ridiculous. They were romanticizing slavery, remembering the food but forgetting the whips. They claimed they had eaten all they wanted in Egypt, but that was a lie. Slaves do not feast, they survive. The Israelites were allowing their present discomfort to distort their memory, but God in His mercy chose to provide for them despite their grumbling. He said to Moses, "I will rain down bread from heaven for you. The people are to go out each day and gather enough for that day. In this way I will test them and see whether they will follow my instructions." God was not just feeding them, He was teaching them dependence and obedience. They would have to trust Him daily for their provision. That evening, quail came and covered the camp. The Israelites had meat to eat, and in the morning there was a layer of dew around the camp. When the dew was gone, thin flakes like frost appeared on the desert floor. The Israelites looked at it and asked each other, "What is it?" Moses said to them, "It is the bread the Lord has given you to eat." The people called it manna, which means, "What is it?" It was white like coriander seed and tasted like wafers made with honey. God gave specific instructions about gathering the manna. Each person was to gather as much as they needed, about 2 quarts per person. They were not to keep any of it until morning. But some of the Israelites did not listen. They kept part of it until morning, and it was full of maggots and began to smell. Moses was angry with them because they had disobeyed God's clear command. Every morning, each person gathered as much manna as they needed. But when the sun grew hot, the manna melted away. On the 6th day, they were to gather twice as much, because the 7th day was a Sabbath, a day of rest. The manna gathered on the 6th day did not spoil overnight. This was another miracle within the miracle. God was teaching the Israelites to honor the Sabbath, to trust that He would provide, and to rest in His care. For 40 years, the Israelites ate manna. Every single day, God provided bread from heaven. It was a daily reminder of His faithfulness. Yet despite this constant provision, the people continued to grumble and complain. From the desert of Sin, they traveled to Rephidim, but there was no water for the people to drink. Once again, they quarreled with Moses. "Give us water to drink." Moses replied, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you put the Lord to the test?" But the people were thirsty and grumbled against Moses. "Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to make us and our children and livestock die of thirst?" Moses cried out to the Lord, "What am I to do with these people? They are almost ready to stone me." The people's anger had reached a dangerous level. They were willing to kill Moses, the man who had led them out of slavery. God told Moses to take some of the elders and his staff and go to the rock at Horeb. "I will stand there before you by the rock at Horeb. Strike the rock, and water will come out of it for the people to drink." Moses did as God commanded. He struck the rock in the sight of the elders, and water gushed out. The people and their livestock drank freely. Moses named a place Massah and Meribah, which means testing and quarreling, because the Israelites quarreled and tested the Lord, saying, "Is the Lord among us or not?" It was a tragic question. After everything they had seen, the plagues, the Passover, the Red Sea, the manna, they still doubted God's presence. While the Israelites were camped at Rephidim, they faced their first military threat. The Amalekites came and attacked them. Moses told Joshua, "Choose some of our men and go out to fight the Amalekites. Tomorrow I will stand on top of the hill with the staff of God in my hands." Joshua fought the Amalekites as Moses had ordered, and Moses, Aaron, and Hur went to the top of the hill. As long as Moses held up his hands, the Israelites were winning. But whenever he lowered his hands, the Amalekites were winning. This was a test of endurance and dependence. The battle was won not just by swords, but by prayer and intercession. When Moses' hands grew tired, Aaron and Hur brought a stone for him to sit on. Then they stood on each side of him and held up his hands so that his hands remained steady until sunset. Joshua overcame the Amalekite army with the sword. This battle taught Israel an important lesson. Victory comes from God. Human effort is necessary, but divine support is essential. After the battle, Moses built an altar and called it, "The Lord is my banner." He said, "Because hands were lifted up against the throne of the Lord will be at war against the Amalekites from generation to generation." God had defended His people, and He would continue to do so. But the Israelites still had much to learn about trust, obedience, and faithfulness. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that God provides daily bread, both physical and spiritual. What do you think God is teaching you right now through your wilderness season? Chapter 10, Tendada on the Sacred Peak. 3 months after leaving Egypt, the Israelites arrived at the desert of Sinai and camped in front of the mountain. This was the same mountain where God had appeared to Moses in the burning bush. It was called Horeb and also Sinai, and it was about to become the most sacred location in Israel's history. Here, God would give His law. Here, He would establish His covenant. Here, Israel would become not just a people, but a holy nation. Moses went up the mountain to meet with God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain. "This is what you are to say to the descendants of Jacob and what you are to tell the people of Israel. You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." God was making an incredible offer. He was inviting Israel into a special relationship. They would be his treasured possession, a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Their purpose was not just to be blessed, but to be a blessing. They were to represent God to the world and bring the world to God. This calling was both an honor and a responsibility. Moses went back down the mountain and summoned the elders. He told them everything the Lord had said, and the people all responded together. "We will do everything the Lord has said." Moses reported their words to the Lord, and God told him to prepare the people for a divine encounter. "Go to the people and consecrate them today and tomorrow. Have them wash their clothes and be ready by the third day, because on that day the Lord will come down on Mount Sinai in the sight of all the people." God also gave strict boundaries, put limits for the people around the mountain, and tell them to be careful that they do not approach the mountain or touch the foot of it. Whoever touches the mountain is to be put to death. Why such harsh restrictions? Because God is holy. His holiness is so pure, so intense, that sinful humanity cannot approach him without being consumed. The boundaries around the mountain were not to keep people out for no reason. They were to protect the people from the overwhelming presence of God's glory. Even animals that touched the mountain would die. This was a lesson in reverence, in understanding that God is not a casual friend, but the Almighty Creator. On the morning of the third day, there was thunder and lightning, with a thick cloud over the mountain and a very loud trumpet blast. Everyone in the camp trembled. Moses led the people out of the camp to meet with God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. Mount Sinai was covered with smoke because the Lord descended on it in fire. The smoke billowed up from it like smoke from a furnace, and the whole mountain trembled violently. As the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder, Moses spoke, and the voice of God answered him. The Lord descended to the top of Mount Sinai and called Moses to the top of the mountain. Moses went up, and God warned him again to make sure the people did not force their way through to see the Lord, or many of them would perish. Moses went down and told the people, and then, in the hearing of all Israel, God spoke. His voice thundered across the mountain like nothing the people had ever heard. He gave them 10 foundational commands that would shape their identity and their relationship with him. "I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me." This was the first and most important commandment. God was declaring his exclusive right to Israel's worship. He had rescued them, and he alone deserved their loyalty and devotion. In a world filled with countless gods, this was a radical statement. Israel's God was not one among many. He was the only true God. The second commandment forbade idolatry. "You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above, or on the earth beneath, or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them." God cannot be reduced to a statue or painting. He is spirit, infinite and eternal. Any attempt to represent him with an image dishonors his majesty and leads people into false worship. The third commandment protected God's name. "You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not hold anyone guiltless who misuses his name." God's name represents his character and reputation. To use it carelessly, flippantly, or deceitfully is to treat God with contempt. The fourth commandment established the Sabbath. "Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God." The Sabbath was a gift, a day of rest that reminded Israel of God's rest after creation. It was also a sign of trust. By resting 1 day a week, the Israelites demonstrated that they trusted God to provide for them. They did not need to work 7 days to survive. God would bless the 6 days of work and sustain them. The fifth commandment addressed family. "Honor your father and your mother, so that you may live long in the land the Lord your God is giving you." Respecting parents was the foundation of a stable society. It taught children to honor authority and value wisdom. The sixth commandment was brief but absolute. "You shall not murder." Human life is sacred because people are made in the image of God. To take innocent life is to attack God's image. The seventh commandment protected marriage. You shall not commit adultery. Marriage is a covenant before God, and sexual faithfulness is essential to trust, family, and community. The eighth commandment guarded property. You shall not steal. Respecting what belongs to others is a basic principle of justice and order. The ninth commandment upheld truth. You shall not give false testimony against your neighbor. Lies destroy relationships, corrupt justice, and undermine society. Truth is essential to living in community. The 10th commandment addressed the heart. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male or female servant, his ox or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. Coveting is the root of many other sins. It is desiring what is not yours and allowing that desire to control you. God was teaching Israel that sin begins in the heart, not just in actions. When the people saw the thunder and lightning and heard the trumpet and saw the mountain in smoke, they trembled with fear. They stayed at a distance and said to Moses, "Speak to us yourself, and we will listen. But do not have God speak to us, or we will die." The people were terrified by God's holiness. Moses told them, "Do not be afraid. God has come to test you, so that the fear of God will be with you to keep you from sinning." The people remained at a distance while Moses approached the thick darkness where God was, and God continued to speak, giving Moses additional laws and instructions. These laws covered every aspect of life: justice for crimes, treatment of servants, protection of the vulnerable, rules for worship, festivals and sacrifices. God was not just giving Israel religious rules. He was giving them a complete system of justice, mercy, and holiness that would set them apart from every other nation. Like this video if you believe God's commands are still relevant today. Comment below which of the 10 commandments challenges you the most. Chapter 11. The Golden Betrayal. Moses went up on the mountain to receive more instructions from God. The Lord said to him, "Come up to me on the mountain and stay here, and I will give you the tablets of stone with the law and commandments I have written for their instruction." Moses set out with Joshua, his aide, and Moses went up on the mountain of God. He said to the elders, "Wait here for us until we come back to you. Aaron and Hur are with you, and anyone involved in a dispute can go to them." Moses entered the cloud, and the glory of the Lord settled on Mount Sinai. For 6 days the cloud covered the mountain, and on the 7th day the Lord called to Moses from within the cloud. To the Israelites, the glory of the Lord looked like a consuming fire on top of the mountain. Then Moses entered the cloud as he went on up the mountain, and he stayed on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights. 40 days is a long time to wait. Down below, the Israelites grew restless. They could see the fire on the mountain, but Moses did not return. Days turned into weeks. Doubt crept into their hearts. What if Moses was dead? What if he had abandoned them? What if God had consumed him? The people began to panic. They had no leader, no direction, no reassurance. Finally, the people gathered around Aaron and said, "Come, make us gods who will go before us. As for this fellow Moses who brought us up out of Egypt, we don't know what has happened to him." It was a shocking betrayal. Just weeks earlier, they had heard God's voice commanding them not to make idols. They had agreed to obey everything the Lord said. But now, in Moses' absence, they were ready to abandon God and worship an idol. Aaron should have refused. He should have reminded the people of God's commands. He should have called them to prayer and patience. But instead, Aaron gave in to their demands. He told them, "Take off the gold earrings that your wives, your sons, and your daughters are wearing, and bring them to me." The people did as he said. Aaron took the gold, melted it down, and fashioned it into the shape of a calf. Then he built an altar in front of the calf and announced, "Tomorrow there will be a festival to the Lord." The next day, the people rose early and sacrificed burnt offerings and presented fellowship offerings. Afterward, they sat down to eat and drink and got up to indulge in revelry. What they were doing was not innocent celebration. It was pagan worship mixed with sexual immorality. They were imitating the fertility rituals of Egypt and Canaan, and they were doing it in the name of the Lord. They claimed to be worshipping Yahweh, but they were worshipping him through an idol shaped like a calf. It was syncretism, blending true worship with false practices, and God was furious. Up on the mountain, the Lord said to Moses, "Go down, because your people whom you brought up out of Egypt have become corrupt. They have been quick to turn away from what I commanded them, and have made themselves an idol cast in the shape of a calf. They have bowed down to it and sacrificed to it, and have said, 'These are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt.'" Notice how God distanced himself from the people. He called them your people, not my people. Their sin had broken the covenant before it even began. God continued, "I have seen these people, and they are a stiff-necked people. Now leave me alone, so that my anger may burn against them, and that I may destroy them. Then I will make you into a great nation." God was offering Moses a way out. He could start over with Moses and fulfill the Abrahamic promises through him. But Moses' response revealed the depth of his love for Israel and his understanding of God's character. Moses sought the favor of the Lord his God. "Lord," he said, "why should your anger burn against your people, whom you brought out of Egypt with great power and a mighty hand? Why should the Egyptians say, 'It was with evil intent that he brought them out, to kill them in the mountains and to wipe them off the face of the earth?' Turn from your fierce anger. Relent and do not bring disaster on your people. Remember your servants Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, to whom you swore by your own self. I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, and I will give your descendants all this land I promised them, and it will be their inheritance forever." Moses was interceding for the people. He appealed to God's reputation, his promises, and his covenant. And the Lord relented. He did not bring the disaster he had threatened. This is one of the most profound examples of intercessory prayer in the Bible. Moses stood in the gap between God's righteous judgment and the people's deserved punishment. He pleaded for mercy, and God granted it. Moses turned and went down the mountain with the 2 tablets of the covenant law in his hands. They were inscribed on both sides, front and back. The tablets were the work of God. The writing was the writing of God, engraved on the tablets. When Joshua heard the noise of the people shouting, he said to Moses, "There is the sound of war in the camp." Moses replied, "It is not the sound of victory. It is not the sound of defeat. It is the sound of singing that I hear." When Moses approached the camp and saw the calf and the dancing, his anger burned. He threw the tablets out of his hands, breaking them to pieces at the foot of the mountain. The shattering of the tablets was symbolic. The people had broken the covenant. Moses took the calf the people had made and burned it in the fire. Then he ground it to powder, scattered it on the water, and made the Israelites drink it. This was an act of judgment and humiliation. Moses confronted Aaron. "What did these people do to you that you led them into such great sin?" Aaron tried to shift the blame. "Do not be angry, my lord. You know how prone these people are to evil. They said to me, 'Make us gods who will go before us.' As for this fellow Moses who brought us up out of Egypt, we don't know what has happened to him." So I told them, "Whoever has any gold jewelry, take it off." Then they gave me the gold, and I threw it into the fire, and out came this calf. Aaron's excuse was pathetic. He acted as if the calf had appeared by magic. He refused to take responsibility for his leadership failure. Moses saw that the people were running wild and that Aaron had let them get out of control and so become a laughingstock to their enemies. Moses stood at the entrance to the camp and said, "Whoever is for the Lord, come to me." And all the Levites rallied to him. Moses gave them a hard command. "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Each man strap a sword to his side. Go back and forth through the camp from one end to the other, each killing his brother and friend and neighbor." The Levites did as Moses commanded, and that day about 3,000 of the people died. It was a terrible judgment, but it was necessary. The cancer of idolatry had to be cut out, or it would spread and destroy the entire nation. The next day Moses said to the people, "You have committed a great sin, but now I will go up to the Lord. Perhaps I can make atonement for your sin." Moses went back to the Lord and said, "Oh, what a great sin these people have committed. They have made themselves gods of gold. But now, please forgive their sin, but if not, then blot me out of the book you have written." Moses was willing to die for his people. He offered his own life in exchange for theirs. God's response was firm. "Whoever has sinned against me, I will blot out of my book." Each person is responsible for their own sin. Moses could not bear the punishment for others, but his willingness to do so foreshadowed the ultimate intercessor, Jesus Christ, who would take upon himself the sins of the world. God sent a plague on the people because of what they did with the calf Aaron had made. Then he told Moses to lead the people to the promised land. But he said, "I will not go with you because you are a stiff-necked people and I might destroy you on the way." The people were devastated. Without God's presence, the journey was meaningless, and Moses himself pleaded with God, "If your presence does not go with us, do not send us up from here. How will anyone know that you are pleased with me and with your people, unless you go with us? What else will distinguish me and your people from all the other people on the face of the earth?" And the Lord said to Moses, "I will do the very thing you have asked, because I am pleased with you, and I know you by name." God's presence would go with them after all. The golden calf incident was a disaster, but it also became a testimony to God's mercy and Moses' faithful intercession. Share this video with someone who needs to know that even when we fail, God's mercy is greater than our sin. Chapter 12. The tent of meeting. After the golden calf disaster, God gave Moses instructions for building the tabernacle, a portable sanctuary where God's presence would dwell among his people. The tabernacle was not just a tent. It was a masterpiece of craftsmanship and symbolism, every detail designed by God himself. It would become the center of Israel's worship and the place where God met with Moses. God had already given Moses the plans for the tabernacle during his first 40 days on the mountain. Now, after the people's repentance, it was time to build it. Moses summoned all the Israelites and told them what God required. They needed gold, silver, bronze, blue, purple, and scarlet yarn, fine linen, goat hair, ram skins, acacia wood, olive oil, spices, and precious stones. These materials would be used to construct the tabernacle and its furnishings. Moses said, "All who are skilled among you are to come and make everything the Lord has commanded." The response was overwhelming. The people brought offerings willingly. Men and women alike came, all who were willing, and brought gold jewelry of all kinds, brooches, earrings, rings, and ornaments. They also brought blue, purple, and scarlet yarn, fine linen, goat hair, ram skins, leather, and acacia wood. Everyone who had silver or bronze brought it as an offering to the Lord. The generosity was so great that the skilled workers came to Moses and said, "The people are bringing more than enough for doing the work the Lord commanded to be done." So Moses gave the command, and this was proclaimed throughout the camp. No man or woman is to make anything else as an offering for the sanctuary. And so the people were restrained from bringing more, because what they already had was more than enough to do all the work. This is one of the few times in history where people had to be told to stop giving. The Israelites, who had grumbled about food and water, were now giving sacrificially and joyfully. Their hearts had been transformed. The tabernacle was constructed exactly according to God's design. It consisted of an outer courtyard surrounded by curtains, and inside the courtyard was the tent itself. The tent had 2 rooms. The first was the holy place, and the second was the most holy place, also called the Holy of Holies. In the courtyard stood the bronze altar, where animals were sacrificed for sin, and the bronze basin, where the priests washed before entering the tent. Inside the holy place were 3 items: the golden lampstand which burned continually, the table of showbread, which held 12 loaves representing the 12 tribes of Israel, and the altar of incense, where fragrant incense was burned morning and evening. Behind a thick veil separating the holy place from the most holy place was the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark was a gold-covered chest containing the tablets of the 10 Commandments, a jar of manna, and Aaron's staff that had budded. On top of the Ark was the mercy seat, a gold lid with 2 cherubim whose wings overshadowed it. This was the place where God's presence dwelt. Once a year, on the Day of Atonement, the high priest would enter the most holy place and sprinkle blood on the mercy seat to atone for the sins of the people. Every detail of the tabernacle had meaning. The colors represented royalty, sacrifice, and purity. The gold symbolized God's holiness. The bronze represented judgment. The veil separating the holy place from the most holy place showed that sinful people could not casually approach a holy God. Only through the blood of a sacrifice and the mediation of a priest could there be access to God's presence. When the tabernacle was completed, Moses inspected all the work. The Israelites had done everything just as the Lord commanded Moses. So Moses blessed them. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Set up the tabernacle, the tent of meeting, on the first day of the first month." Moses did everything just as the Lord commanded him. The tabernacle was set up on the first day of the first month, in the second year after the Israelites came out of Egypt. Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Moses could not enter the tent of meeting because the cloud had settled on it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. The presence of God was so intense that even Moses, who had spoken with God face to face, could not enter. This was the God of Israel, holy, powerful, dwelling among his people. In all the travels of the Israelites, whenever the cloud lifted from above the tabernacle, they would set out. But if the cloud did not lift, they did not set out until the day it lifted. So the cloud of the Lord was over the tabernacle by day, and fire was in the cloud by night, in the sight of all the Israelites during all their travels. The tabernacle became the visible sign of God's presence. As long as the cloud remained, the people stayed. When the cloud moved, the people followed. God was their guide, their protector, and their provider. The tent of meeting was also the place where Moses met with God. The Lord would speak to Moses face to face as one speaks to a friend. This intimate relationship between God and Moses was unique. No other prophet in the Old Testament enjoyed such direct communication with God. Moses was the mediator between God and Israel, bringing God's words to the people and interceding for the people before God. One day, Moses made a bold request. He said to the Lord, "You have been telling me, 'Lead these people,' but you have not let me know whom you will send with me. You have said, 'I know you by name, and you have found favor with me. If you are pleased with me, teach me your ways, so I may know you and continue to find favor with you. Remember that this nation is your people.'" Moses wanted to know God more deeply. He was not content with just obeying commands. He wanted to understand God's character and heart. The Lord replied, "My presence will go with you, and I will give you rest." Then Moses said, "If your presence does not go with us, do not send us up from here. How will anyone know that you are pleased with me and with your people unless you go with us? What else will distinguish me and your people from all the other people on the face of the earth?" Moses understood that God's presence was what made Israel special. Without God, they were just another wandering group of refugees. And the Lord said to Moses, "I will do the very thing you have asked, because I am pleased with you, and I know you by name." Then Moses said, "Now show me your glory." It was an audacious request. Moses wanted to see the fullness of God's glory, the unveiled majesty of the Creator. But God said, "I will cause all my goodness to pass in front of you, and I will proclaim my name, the Lord, in your presence. I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I will have compassion. But you cannot see my face, for no one may see me and live." God explained that he would place Moses in a cleft in the rock and cover him with his hand as his glory passed by. Then I will remove my hand, and you will see my back, but my face must not be seen. This was as close as any human could come to seeing God and surviving. Moses experienced a level of intimacy with God that surpassed anything we can imagine, and yet, even Moses could not see the full glory of God and live. The tabernacle stood as a testimony to God's desire to dwell with his people. It was not enough for God to deliver Israel from Egypt. He wanted to be with them. The tabernacle was God's way of saying, I am here. I am not distant. I am not indifferent. I am present among you. Centuries later, the Apostle John would write, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. Jesus is the ultimate tabernacle, God dwelling among humanity in human flesh. Comment below what it means to you that God desires to dwell with his people. How do you experience God's presence today? Chapter 13. The serpent curse in water from stun. The Israelites continued their journey through the wilderness, guided by the cloud and the fire. But despite God's constant presence and provision, the people continued to struggle with faith. One of the most tragic incidents occurred at a place called the Wilderness of Zin. The entire Israelite community arrived at the desert of Zin, and they stayed at Kadesh. Miriam, Moses' sister, died and was buried there. This was a significant loss. Miriam had watched over Moses as a baby. She had led the women in worship after the Red Sea crossing. Her death marked the passing of the older generation. Now there was no water for the community, and the people gathered in opposition to Moses and Aaron. They quarreled with Moses and said, if only we had died when our brothers fell dead before the Lord. Why did you bring the Lord's community into this wilderness, that we and our livestock should die here? Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to this terrible place? It has no grain or figs, grapevines or pomegranates, and there is no water to drink. It was the same complaint they had made many times before. They blamed Moses for their hardship. They forgot that God had delivered them from slavery. They forgot the miracles they had witnessed. They only saw their immediate discomfort. Moses and Aaron went from the assembly to the entrance of the tent of meeting and fell face down, and the glory of the Lord appeared to them. The Lord said to Moses, take the staff, and you and your brother Aaron gather the assembly together. Speak to that rock before their eyes, and it will pour out its water. God's instruction was clear. Speak to the rock. God was going to perform another miracle, providing water from a stone. But this time, Moses was to speak, not strike. Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly in front of the rock, and Moses said to them, listen, you rebels, must we bring you water out of this rock? Moses was frustrated and angry. He had endured years of complaints, rebellion, and ingratitude. His patience had worn thin. And in that moment of anger, Moses made a costly mistake. He raised his arm and struck the rock twice with his staff. Water gushed out, and the community and their livestock drank. The miracle happened. The people got their water. But Moses had disobeyed God. He was supposed to speak to the rock, not strike it. And he had also taken credit for the miracle, saying, must we bring you water out of this rock? He made it sound like he and Aaron were providing the water, not God. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, because you did not trust in me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites, you will not bring this community into the land I give them. It was a devastating judgment. After 40 years of faithful leadership, Moses would not enter the promised land. One moment of anger and disobedience cost him the fulfillment of his life's work. The place was called Meribah, which means quarreling, because the Israelites quarreled with the Lord and because he was proved holy among them. This incident raises difficult questions. Was God's punishment too harsh? Moses had served faithfully for decades. He had interceded for the people countless times. He had endured their complaints and rebellion. Did one mistake really deserve such a severe consequence? The answer lies in understanding Moses' role. He was not just a leader, he was God's representative. When he struck the rock instead of speaking to it, he misrepresented God's character. He acted out of frustration rather than faith, and he took credit for what only God could do. Moreover, the rock had symbolic significance. The Apostle Paul would later write that the rock was Christ. The rock being struck the first time back at Horeb symbolized Christ being struck once for our sins. Speaking to the rock symbolized prayer and faith. By striking the rock again, Moses obscured the picture of Christ's once-for-all sacrifice. God's standards for leaders are high because their influence is great. Moses' failure was not just personal, it affected how people viewed God. Moses accepted God's judgment without complaint. He did not argue or plead for the decision to be reversed. He knew he had failed, and he continued to serve faithfully even knowing he would not enter the promised land. This is one of the marks of true leadership. Moses did not quit just because he would not see the final victory. He kept leading, teaching, and interceding for the people he loved. Another significant event during the wilderness journey was the plague of venomous snakes. The Israelites had spoken against God and against Moses. "Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the desert? There is no bread, there is no water, and we detest this miserable food." They were complaining about the manna, the miraculous bread from heaven that God had faithfully provided for years. Their ingratitude was appalling, so the Lord sent venomous snakes among them. They bit the people, and many Israelites died. The punishment was swift and severe. The people came to Moses and said, "We sinned when we spoke against the Lord and against you. Pray that the Lord will take the snakes away from us." So Moses prayed for the people. This was Moses' consistent response to Israel's failures. No matter how often they rebelled, he always interceded. The Lord said to Moses, "Make a snake and put it up on a pole. Anyone who is bitten can look at it and live." So Moses made a bronze snake and put it up on a pole. Then, when anyone was bitten by a snake and looked at the bronze snake, they lived. This was another miraculous provision, but it was also a test of faith. The people had to believe that looking at a bronze snake would save them. It made no logical sense. It required trust in God's word. Centuries later, Jesus would refer to this event. Just as Moses lifted up the snake in the wilderness, so the Son of Man must be lifted up, that everyone who believes may have eternal life in him. Jesus was making a profound connection. Just as the Israelites looked to the bronze snake and were saved from physical death, so people must look to Jesus on the cross to be saved from spiritual death. Salvation comes not by our effort, but by faith in God's provision. The wilderness years were filled with both rebellion and redemption. The Israelites failed repeatedly, but God remained faithful. He disciplined them, but he did not abandon them. He provided for them daily. He protected them from enemies. He guided them with the cloud and fire. And he patiently prepared them for the promised land. Moses led them through all of it, a man marked by both great faith and human weakness, a man who loved God and loved his people despite their constant failures. Like this video, if you have ever struggled with obeying God when you were frustrated, what do you think Moses could have done differently at the rock? Chapter 14. 40 years of testing. The wilderness journey was never meant to last 40 years. When the Israelites left Mount Sinai, they were only a short distance from the promised land, but their lack of faith turned an 11-day journey into a 40-year ordeal. The turning point came at Kadesh Barnea, when Moses sent 12 spies to explore the land of Canaan. The Lord said to Moses, "Send some men to explore the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the Israelites. From each ancestral tribe send one of its leaders." Moses selected 12 men, including Joshua and Caleb. He gave them specific instructions. "Go up through the Negev and on into the hill country. See what the land is like and whether the people who live there are strong or weak, few or many. What kind of land do they live in? Is it good or bad? What kind of towns do they live in? Are they unwalled or fortified? How is the soil? Is it fertile or poor? Are there trees in it or not? Do your best to bring back some of the fruit of the land." The 12 spies spent 40 days exploring Canaan. When they returned, they brought back a single cluster of grapes so large that 2 men had to carry it on a pole between them. They also brought pomegranates and figs. The land was indeed abundant, flowing with milk and honey. But the spies also reported on the people living there. "They are powerful, and the cities are fortified and very large. We even saw descendants of Anak there. The Amalekites live in the Negev. The Hittites, Jebusites, and Amorites live in the hill country, and the Canaanites live near the sea and along the Jordan." Caleb silenced the people before Moses and said, "We should go up and take possession of the land, for we can certainly do it." But the other 10 spies disagreed. "We can't attack those people. They're stronger than we are, and they spread a bad report about the land. The land we explored devours those living in it. All the people we saw there are of great size. We saw the Nephilim there. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them." The report of the 10 spies filled the community with fear. That night, all the members of the community raised their voices and wept aloud. The Israelites grumbled against Moses and Aaron, and the whole assembly said to them, "If only we had died in Egypt or in this wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us to this land only to let us fall by the sword? Our wives and children will be taken as plunder. Wouldn't it be better for us to go back to Egypt?" And they said to each other, "We should choose a leader and go back to Egypt." Their response was shocking. They were willing to return to slavery rather than trust God. They forgot everything God had done for them. They forgot the plagues, the Red Sea, the manna, the quail, the water from the rock, God's presence in the cloud and fire. They saw only the obstacles, not the God who could overcome them. Moses and Aaron fell face down in front of the whole Israelite assembly. Joshua and Caleb tore their clothes, a sign of deep distress, and addressed the assembly. "The land we passed through and explored is exceedingly good. If the Lord is pleased with us, he will lead us into that land, a land flowing with milk and honey, and will give it to us. Only do not rebel against the Lord, and do not be afraid of the people of the land, because we will devour them. Their protection is gone, but the Lord is with us. Do not be afraid of them." But the whole assembly talked about stoning Joshua and Caleb. The people were so consumed by fear that they wanted to kill the 2 men who spoke the truth. Then the glory of the Lord appeared at the tent of meeting to all the Israelites. The Lord said to Moses, "How long will these people treat me with contempt? How long will they refuse to believe in me, in spite of all the signs I have performed among them? I will strike them down with a plague and destroy them, but I will make you into a nation greater and stronger than they." Once again, God offered Moses a way out. He could start over with a new nation descended from Moses, but once again, Moses interceded for the people. He appealed to God's reputation among the nations and to his character of mercy. "In accordance with your great love, forgive the sin of these people, just as you have pardoned them from the time they left Egypt until now." The Lord replied, "I have forgiven them as you asked. Nevertheless, as surely as I live and as surely as the glory of the Lord fills the whole earth, not one of those who saw my glory and the signs I performed in Egypt and in the wilderness, but who disobeyed me and tested me 10 times, not one of them will ever see the land I promised on oath to their ancestors. No one who has treated me with contempt will ever see it." God pronounced judgment. The entire generation of adults who had left Egypt, except for Joshua and Caleb, would die in the wilderness. Their children would enter the promised land, but they would not. For 40 years, corresponding to the 40 days the spies explored the land, the Israelites would wander in the wilderness until the last of that faithless generation had died. It was a tragic and sobering judgment. When Moses reported this to the Israelites, they mourned bitterly. Early the next morning, they set out for the highest point in the hill country, saying, "Now we are ready to go up to the land the Lord promised. Surely we have sinned." But Moses warned them, Why are you disobeying the Lord's command? This will not succeed. Do not go up, because the Lord is not with you. You will be defeated by your enemies. The Amalekites and the Canaanites will face you there. Because you have turned away from the Lord, He will not be with you, and you will fall by the sword. The Israelites ignored Moses' warning. In their arrogance, they went up toward the highest point in the hill country. But Moses and the ark of the Lord's covenant did not move from the camp. Then the Amalekites and the Canaanites who lived in that hill country came down and attacked them and beat them down all the way to Hormah. It was a devastating defeat. The Israelites had tried to obey in their own strength and timing, and they failed. Obedience without faith is just as rebellious as disobedience. And so began the 40 years of wandering. During this time, the older generation gradually died off. Moses continued to lead, teach, and intercede. The tabernacle was at the center of the camp. God's presence remained with them, but it was a time of waiting, of discipline, of preparation. The younger generation, who had been children when they left Egypt, grew up hearing the stories of God's faithfulness. They learned to trust God in ways their parents had not. During these years, there were continued rebellions. Korah, a Levite, led a revolt against Moses and Aaron, claiming that all the people were holy and that Moses and Aaron had exalted themselves above the community. God judged Korah and his followers by causing the earth to open and swallow them alive. It was a terrifying display of God's justice and a clear affirmation of Moses' leadership. There were also battles with enemy nations. The Israelites defeated the Canaanite king of Arad. They marched around the land of Edom because the Edomites refused them passage. They defeated Sihon king of the Amorites and Og king of Bashan, taking possession of their lands on the east side of the Jordan River. These victories were proof that God was with them and that the new generation was learning to trust Him. Aaron, Moses' brother and Israel's first high priest, died on Mount Hor at the age of 123. The entire community mourned for him for 30 days. His son Eleazar succeeded him as high priest. Miriam had already died earlier. Moses was the last of the original leaders from Egypt, and his own days were numbered. The 40 years were coming to an end. The promised land was within sight, and a new generation was ready to enter. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that God disciplines those He loves, but His discipline is always for our good and His glory. Chapter 15, The Age of Promise. As the 40 years drew to a close, the Israelites camped on the plains of Moab, across the Jordan River from Jericho. The promised land was finally within reach. An entire generation had passed away, but their children were alive and ready. God was about to fulfill His promise. But first, there were battles to fight, lessons to learn, and a final blessing to receive from their aging leader. One of the strangest and most controversial events of this period involved Balaam, a pagan prophet hired by Balak, the king of Moab, to curse Israel. Balak was terrified of the Israelites. He had seen what they did to the Amorites, and he feared his own nation would be destroyed. So he sent messengers to Balaam with payment and a request. "Come and put a curse on these people, because they are too powerful for me. Perhaps then I will be able to defeat them and drive them out of the land. For I know that whoever you bless is blessed, and whoever you curse is cursed." Balaam was a diviner who worshipped pagan gods, but God spoke to him and warned him not to curse Israel. "These people are blessed," God said. But Balak persisted, offering Balaam greater rewards. Eventually, God allowed Balaam to go, but only to speak what God told him to speak. On the journey, the angel of the Lord stood in the road to oppose Balaam. Balaam's donkey saw the angel and refused to move. Balaam beat the donkey, and then the Lord opened the donkey's mouth and it spoke. "What have I done to you to make you beat me these 3 times?" It is one of the most bizarre moments in Scripture, a talking donkey. Then the Lord opened Balaam's eyes, and he saw the angel standing in the road with a drawn sword. Balaam bowed low and fell face down. The angel rebuked him and warned him to speak only what God commanded. When Balaam met with Balak, he was taken to overlook the Israelite camp. Balak expected Balaam to curse Israel, but instead Balaam blessed them. How can I curse those whom God has not cursed? How can I denounce those whom the Lord has not denounced? Balak was furious, but every time he brought Balaam to a different location to try again, the same thing happened. Balaam blessed Israel instead of cursing them. He declared, God is not human, that he should lie, not a human being, that he should change his mind. Does he speak and then not act? Does he promise and not fulfill? I have received a command to bless. He has blessed, and I cannot change it. Balaam also prophesied about Israel's future, including a prophecy about a coming king. A star will come out of Jacob. A scepter will rise out of Israel. This was a messianic prophecy pointing to Jesus. Though Balaam could not curse Israel, he later gave Balak advice on how to corrupt them. If you cannot destroy them with a curse, entice them to sin. The Moabites and Midianites invited the Israelite men to their pagan festivals, where they worshipped their gods and engaged in sexual immorality. Many Israelite men participated, and God's anger burned against Israel. A plague broke out, killing 24,000 people before it was stopped by the zealous action of Phinehas, Aaron's grandson, who executed 2 blatant offenders. This incident was a sobering reminder that the greatest danger to Israel was not external enemies, but internal compromise. When they remained faithful to God, no nation could defeat them. But when they turned to idols and immorality, they brought judgment on themselves. Moses understood this, and as the time of his death approached, he began preparing the people for life in the promised land without him. God commanded Moses to take a census of the new generation. The total number of men 20 years old or more who were able to serve in the army was 601,730. This was almost the same number as the generation that had left Egypt 40 years earlier. God had been faithful to his promise to make Abraham's descendants as numerous as the stars. Moses also appointed Joshua as his successor. The Lord said to Moses, "Take Joshua son of Nun, a man in whom is the spirit of leadership, and lay your hand on him. Have him stand before Eleazar the priest and the entire assembly and commission him in their presence." Moses did as the Lord commanded. He laid his hands on Joshua and commissioned him, just as the Lord instructed through him. This public commissioning was important. It established Joshua's authority and assured the people that God had chosen him. Joshua had been Moses' assistant for 40 years. He had fought the Amalekites. He had gone partway up Mount Sinai with Moses. He had been one of the 2 faithful spies. He was ready for leadership. But he would need courage and faith to lead Israel into battle. In the final months before his death, Moses delivered a series of speeches to the Israelites. These speeches are recorded in the book of Deuteronomy, which means second law. Moses recounted their history, reminding them of God's faithfulness and their repeated failures. He urged them to obey God's commands and to love the Lord with all their heart, soul, and strength. He warned them about the dangers of idolatry and compromise. And he set before them a choice. "See, I set before you today life and prosperity, death and destruction. For I command you today to love the Lord your God, to walk in obedience to him, and to keep his commands, decrees, and laws. Then you will live and increase, and the Lord your God will bless you in the land you are entering to possess." Moses also prophesied about Israel's future. He warned that they would eventually turn away from God and be scattered among the nations. But he also promised that God would bring them back and restore them. He spoke of a prophet like himself whom God would raise up, a prophet to whom the people must listen. This was another prophecy pointing forward to Jesus, the ultimate prophet, who would speak God's final word to humanity. Moses taught the people a song to remind them of God's faithfulness and their own tendency to rebel. He blessed each of the 12 tribes, pronouncing God's favor and purpose over them, and then he prepared to die. Moses was 120 years old when he died, yet his eyes were not weak, nor his strength gone. He was still physically strong, but God's appointed time had come. Moses had been told he could not enter the promised land, and he accepted that with grace and submission. Before his death, Moses wrote down the law and gave it to the Levites, instructing them to read it to the people every 7 years. He wanted to ensure that future generations would know God's commands and the history of their deliverance. Moses understood that Israel's survival depended not on military strength or political power, but on their faithfulness to God's covenant. As long as they obeyed, they would be blessed. When they rebelled, they would suffer. Comment below what stands out most to you about Moses' leadership. How do you think Joshua felt knowing he had to follow in Moses' footsteps? Chapter 16. The Mountain of Fiery Bowl. The time had come for Moses to die. The Lord said to him, "Go up this mountain in the Abarim range to Mount Nebo in Moab, across from Jericho, and view Canaan, the land I am giving the Israelites as their own possession. There on the mountain that you have climbed, you will die and be gathered to your people, just as your brother Aaron died on Mount Hor and was gathered to his people." God's words were clear and final. Moses would see the promised land, that he would not enter it. Moses climbed Mount Nebo alone. At 120 years old, he made the ascent without difficulty. His eyes were still clear, his body was still strong, but his time on earth was ending. From the top of Mount Nebo, Moses looked out over the land God had promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob hundreds of years earlier. He could see Gilead as far as Dan. He could see all of Naphtali, the territory of Ephraim and Manasseh. He could see all the land of Judah as far as the Mediterranean Sea. He could see the Negev and the whole region from the valley of Jericho, the city of palms as far as Zor. Then the Lord said to him, "This is the land I promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, when I said, 'I will give it to your descendants.' I have let you see it with your eyes, but you will not cross over into it." God had kept his promise to show Moses the land, but the consequences of Moses' disobedience at Meribah remained. Moses would not enter. Still, there is no record of Moses complaining or arguing. He had lived a life of faithful service. He had seen God's glory, spoken with God face to face, delivered a nation from slavery, received the law, interceded countless times for a rebellious people, and led them for 40 years through the wilderness. His legacy was secure, and Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in Moab, as the Lord had said. He buried him in Moab, in the valley opposite Beth Peor. But to this day, no one knows where his grave is. The fact that God himself buried Moses is remarkable. There was no funeral procession, no monument, no tomb for pilgrims to visit. God took care of Moses personally, honoring him in death as he had called him in life. The hidden grave prevented the Israelites from turning it into a shrine and worshipping Moses instead of God. Moses was 120 years old when he died, yet his eyes were not weak nor his strength gone. The Israelites grieved for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days, until the time of weeping and mourning was over. The people mourned deeply. Moses had been their leader, teacher, intercessor, and guide for 4 decades. He had shaped their identity as a nation. He had brought them God's law. He had stood between them and God's judgment again and again. Now he was gone. Now Joshua, son of Nun, was filled with the spirit of wisdom because Moses had laid his hands on him. So the Israelites listened to him and did what the Lord had commanded Moses. Leadership had passed to a new generation. Joshua would lead Israel into the promised land. He would fight the battles. He would distribute the inheritance. He would see the fulfillment of what Moses could only see from a distance. But Joshua's success would be built on the foundation Moses had laid. The book of Deuteronomy ends with these words, "Since then, no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face, who did all those signs and wonders the Lord sent him to do in Egypt, to Pharaoh and to all his officials and to his whole land. For no one has ever shown the mighty power or performed the awesome deeds that Moses did in the sight of all Israel." Moses was unique. His relationship with God was unparalleled. His leadership was unmatched. His faithfulness, despite his flaws, was remarkable. But Moses' story does not end with his death. Centuries later, on a mountain in Israel, something extraordinary happened. Jesus took Peter, James, and John up a high mountain. There, Jesus was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as the light. And who appeared with him? Moses and Elijah. They were talking with Jesus about his coming death in Jerusalem. Moses, who had died on Mount Nebo and been buried by God, was alive. He stood with Jesus, the fulfillment of all the law and the prophets. Moses had seen the promised land from a distance, but in the end, he entered a greater promised land, the presence of God in eternity. The earthly Canaan was only a shadow of the true homeland, the kingdom of God. Moses had led Israel out of slavery in Egypt, but Jesus would lead all who believe out of slavery to sin. Moses gave the law, but Jesus fulfilled the law. Moses interceded for Israel, but Jesus intercedes for all who come to God through him. The life of Moses points us forward to Jesus in countless ways. The Passover lamb foreshadowed Jesus, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. The manna in the wilderness pointed to Jesus, the bread of life. The water from the rock symbolized Jesus who offers living water. The bronze snake lifted up in the wilderness prefigured Jesus being lifted up on the cross. The tabernacle where God dwelt among his people was a picture of Jesus, God in human flesh dwelling among us. Moses' life teaches us about faith, obedience, leadership, intercession, and the faithfulness of God. He was not a perfect man. He made mistakes, he struggled with anger and doubt, but he trusted God and obeyed him, and God used him to accomplish one of the greatest acts of deliverance in history. Moses' story reminds us that God does not call the qualified, he qualifies the called. He uses ordinary people who are willing to trust him and obey. As we reflect on Moses' life, we are challenged to consider our own response to God. Will we trust him when the path is unclear? Will we obey him even when it is costly? Will we intercede for others even when they do not deserve it? Will we lead with humility and courage? Will we persevere when the journey is long and difficult? Moses' example calls us to live lives of faith and faithfulness, trusting that God is with us every step of the way. The God who called Moses from a burning bush is the same God who calls us today. The God who parted the Red Sea can make a way through our impossible situations. The God who provided manna in the wilderness will provide for our needs. The God who dwelt in the tabernacle now dwells in us by his Spirit. The God who led Israel to the promised land is leading us to an eternal home that will never fade or perish. And just as Moses finished his race with faith, we too can run our race with endurance, looking to Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith. Moses lived, led, and died trusting in God's promises, and his faith was not in vain. Today, Moses is remembered as one of the greatest leaders in history. His name is honored by Jews, Christians, and Muslims. His law shaped Western civilization. His story has inspired countless generations to trust God and pursue freedom. But more than anything else, Moses' life points us to the God who delivers, the God who saves, the God who keeps his promises. Subscribe if this journey through the life of Moses has inspired you. Share this video with someone who needs to hear about God's faithfulness, and comment below what lesson from Moses' life has impacted you the most. May we all live with the faith, courage, and obedience of Moses, trusting that the same God who called him is calling us to fulfill his purposes in our generation. The story of Moses is not just ancient history. It is a living testimony to the power and faithfulness of God, and it invites us to become part of God's ongoing story of redemption.